Some relationships exist entirely in the open. Every milestone shared, every moment documented, every chapter written in plain sight for anyone who cares to read it. And then there are the ones that live somewhere quieter, the ones that grow slowly, without announcement, in the margins of public life where the cameras don't reach and the headlines never follow. Savannah Guthrie has been one of the most recognizable faces in American television for years. Warm, composed, precise, she is the kind of presence that makes difficult mornings feel manageable. The kind of journalist people trust not just with information, but with something harder to name. With context, with steadiness, with the sense that however complicated the world outside is, the person in front of you has thought carefully, genuinely, about how to help you understand it. She has that rare quality of making you feel like someone is actually paying attention, not just to the story, but to you. But there was something in her life that most people didn't fully understand, something that had been quietly in place long before the studio lights, long before the morning broadcasts and the breaking news and the career, that put her name in front of millions of people every single day. His name was Michael Feldman, and the story between them was not the one most people assumed it was. It was older than most people knew, more layered than it appeared on the surface, and when the full picture finally began to emerge, when the pieces that had been held so carefully in private started, slowly, to come into the light, what it revealed was not scandal, not betrayal, not the kind of story manufactured for clicks or built to generate outrage. What it revealed was something far more interesting than any of that. Something about timing, about the shape of a life, about two people who had known each other across many different versions of themselves, before the world ever knew them together. And that, it turns out, changes everything about how you read the story. To understand what was really between Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman, you have to go back, not to the moment the story became public, not to the headlines that tried to frame it, not even to the relationship in its most visible form. You have to go back further than all of that, back to who each of them was before the world had formed any opinion about them at all. Savannah Guthrie did not arrive at the Today Show the way some television personalities arrive at their platforms through luck or proximity or a particular talent for being in the right place at the right time. She arrived through years of work that preceded her visibility by a wide margin. She studied law. She practiced it. She covered Washington. She covered courtrooms. She covered the kinds of stories that required not just presence, but genuine, considered understanding of complex systems and the human beings caught inside them. The composure she projects on camera is not a performance. It is the residue of years of discipline, of learning over and over how to hold difficult information steadily enough to communicate it clearly to people who needed to understand it without feeling afraid. Michael Feldman's path was different in its specifics, but similar in its substance. A political operative, a strategist, someone who had spent years working in the spaces where decisions are made and narratives are shaped before anyone outside ever sees them. He was, by the accounts of those who knew his work closely, someone who understood the mechanics of public life from the inside, not as a spectator but as a participant. He was smart in the specific way that politics requires, not just analytically, but humanly, able to read rooms, read people, read the precise gap between what is being said out loud and what is actually being meant. Underneath, what both of them shared, long before they shared anything else, was a fluency in the world of public life. Its rhythms, its particular pressures, its specific demands on the people who choose to move through it. They understood, in a way that not everyone does, what it truly costs to be visible, what it requires of you, what it takes even as it gives you things you couldn't have anticipated wanting. And they had known each other for years before their relationship became something the world felt entitled to weigh in on. That fact alone changes the entire texture of the story. This was not to people swept up in something fast and electric and new. This was something that had developed over time, in the way that certain things only ever can, through repeated contact, through the slow accumulation of genuine understanding, through the particular kind of trust that builds between two people who have watched each other navigate genuinely hard things and come through them still standing. The foundation, By the time it became visible, was not new. It was established, and that matters far more than it might initially seem. By the time most people became aware of Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman as a unit, as to people whose lives had become genuinely, durably intertwined, the relationship between them had already passed through several of its most formative stages, entirely in private. That is not unusual, of course. Most relationships develop away from public view, but in this case, the length and depth of what had already been built before the public chapter even began gives the story a different quality, a different weight, something that the simplified version could never quite carry. People who knew both of them during those earlier years described to people who operated in overlapping worlds without being defined by the overlap. They moved through the same professional circles, attended the same events, knew many of the same people, and both, in their respective lanes, were serious about the work they had chosen. There was a mutual recognition between them, the specific kind of recognition that happens when two people understand each other's professional life from the inside, who don't need to stop and explain certain things because the other person already knows, already feels the weight of it. That kind of recognition is not the same as romance. It doesn't automatically become anything, but it creates a particular ease, a shorthand, a quiet comfort, and those things over time and across enough shared experience can become the foundation of something deeper than either person entirely planned for. Feldman, by the accounts of those who knew him, balanced the intensity of his professional world with a groundedness that the people around him genuinely noticed. He wasn't someone who wore his work as his entire identity or needed the room to know he was in it. He had interests beyond the career. He was, as more than one person has described him, someone you could actually talk to, not perform for, not compete with, simply talk to. In circles where performance is often the default mode of interaction, that quality stands out in a way that stays with people. And Savannah Guthrie, for all the visibility her career had brought, was someone who held her private life with extraordinary care. She was not someone who made her personal world available to the public as content. She protected it, not out of secrecy, but from the particular kind of distortion that arrives when the gaze of a very large audience lands on something intimate and small and real. She had seen enough of public life to understand that not everything true survives being watched by everyone. Some things need shelter to stay whole, together. What they had built before anyone outside their immediate circle fully understood. It was not a dramatic story. It was a quiet one, a deliberate one, to people who knew each other well enough to know what they were building and who had chosen, together, to build it carefully. The stability of that foundation would matter enormously, because what came next would test it in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. There's a specific moment in any private relationship when it stops being entirely private. It doesn't always happen by choice. Sometimes the world simply catches up to something that has been real for a long time, and the catching up is its own kind of disruption, regardless of whether anything has actually changed between the two people it involves. For Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman, that moment arrived against a backdrop that was already complicated. According to public records and widely reported accounts, Savannah had previously been married, and that marriage had ended. The end of any marriage is a private grief, whatever its public circumstances, and for someone in Savannah's position, visible, observed, held to a standard of composure by the very nature of the work she had built her life around, carrying that privately while continuing to show up fully and professionally required a particular kind of internal discipline, the kind most people never have to develop in front of an audience. What became clear in time was that Michael Feldman had been a presence during this period, not in a way that was announced or explained or offered up for public interpretation, but in the way that a person quietly becomes a presence in another person's life, steadily, reliably, without needing the moment to be witnessed to be real. According to reports and accounts from people familiar with the timeline, the connection between them deepened during a period that was, by any honest measure, one of the more personally demanding stretches of Savannah's life. That context changes what the relationship represents. This is not a story about two people meeting under ideal conditions and choosing each other easily, cleanly, without complication. It is a story about a connection that held and deepened during difficulty. The kind of difficulty that strips away whatever is superficial and leaves you. The question that doesn't get asked often enough is what happens to the person inside that armor? What happens to the private self when the public self is required to project competence and steadiness through everything, through difficulty, through loss, through the normal human chaos of a life being actually, honestly lived? Michael Feldman, by the accounts of people who know him well, engaged with that question seriously, not in the abstract, in practice. He was not someone who needed the public version of Savannah. He knew the private one. He had known it across time, across circumstances, and the understanding between them was built on that knowledge rather than on the image. That distinction between loving the image and knowing the person is not a small one, and according to those close to them, it was central to what made the relationship function. There was no performance required between them, no need to manage the distance between who she was in public and who she was at home, because the person she was with had never confused the two versions or mistaken one for the other. At the same time, the pressures of both their lives were real and constant. To people with demanding, high-profile careers, operating in a world that rewards availability and punishes retreat, finding genuine space for a private life inside that kind of professional existence doesn't happen automatically. It requires intention. It requires choosing, again and again, to protect something that the world would otherwise absorb without even noticing. That protective instinct, the choice to hold certain things back from the public narrative, would come to be misread by some as secrecy. But those who understood the full picture describe it differently, not hiding, guarding, to people who understood what they had and refused to let it become something the world simply consumed. There are moments in any long-developing story when the pace changes suddenly and without warning, when what had been moving slowly, carefully, at a chosen rhythm, accelerates beyond the control of the people inside it, when the story stops being something you are shaping and becomes something that is actively happening to you. For Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman, that acceleration arrived not from anything either of them chose, but from a convergence of circumstances that pressed their private world into a far more public frame. Her professional life had always been visible, but during certain periods, moments of major national stories, shifts in the broader media landscape, the particular pressures of an industry in constant transformation, that visibility intensified in ways that were impossible to fully anticipate or manage. And at the same time, questions began to surface, not about anything specifically wrong, but the kind of questions that form when people who are already curious about someone's life start paying attention in a more focused, more deliberate way. Questions about timing, about relationships, about the private life of someone whose public life had been so carefully, consistently maintained. What those questions eventually uncovered was a timeline that raised its own set of observations. According to reports and public accounts, the specific sequence of events in Savannah's personal life, the end of her first marriage, the deepening of her relationship with Feldman, the eventual public acknowledgement of that relationship, involved a period where the full picture was not immediately visible. To those watching from the outside, no wrongdoing has been established. No official conclusions have been reached. What has been noted, across various reports and accounts, is simply that the timeline as it became public was more layered than the initial understanding suggested. The response to that layering was, as it so often is, a mixture of genuine curiosity and less careful interpretation. Some people engaged with the complexity honestly. Others moved toward simpler, more satisfying narratives, the kind that offer clean judgment without requiring the full picture to be considered first. And what got lost inside that noise was the human reality of what the timeline actually represented. Not concealment, not scandal, but the ordinary, often uncomfortable truth that lives don't end and begin on clean schedules. That people find their way toward the people they need during periods that are already complicated. That the most meaningful chapters in any life are rarely the tedious ones. And the mess of them doesn't make them less real. For Savannah Guthrie, navigating that complexity publicly, continuing to show up, To be present and composed and reliable while carrying a personal life being actively scrutinized required something that rarely gets acknowledged in these conversations: an enormous and quiet internal steadiness, the kind that doesn't broadcast itself. And the fact that she maintained the professional standard she did through all of it is something the people who work alongside her will speak about without prompting, without being asked. Strip away the noise, and what remains is a story about two people trying to build something real inside a world that is persistently, relentlessly interested in turning real things into content. That is the part that gets lost, not just in this story, but in all stories like it. The public appetite for the personal lives of visible people is not a neutral force. It shapes what gets told. It shapes how. It creates strong incentives for simplification and rewards the version of events that produces the strongest reaction, regardless of whether that version is the most accurate or the most fair to the people living inside it. In the case of Savannah Guthrie and Michael Feldman, what that appetite produced was an ongoing attempt to fit a genuinely complicated human story into a framework it simply didn't fit. The labels available to describe what they were to each other, the timelines that were applied, the narratives constructed around the sequence of events, were always slightly too small for what was actually there. Because what was actually there was a long and layered history between two intelligent, private, professionally accomplished people who had navigated serious life transitions and come through them with a commitment to each other that, by the evidence of everything that followed, was genuine and durable. They married. They built a family. According to public accounts, they moved through the considerable demands of their respective careers while maintaining the private life they had worked so hard to protect. The children who came into that life, the home they built together, the daily reality of two people with complex professional identities choosing also to be present and genuinely invested in the intimate life between them. That is the story the simpler versions never quite reached. That is the part that got edited out in the interest of a cleaner narrative. What the scrutiny of their relationship ultimately revealed, not about them, but about the culture that produced the scrutiny, is something worth sitting with quietly. We are collectively far better at consuming the beginnings and endings of relationships than we are at honoring the middles. The long, unglamorous, deeply human middle, where the people are simply trying every day to figure out how to stay. That part doesn't generate conversation. It doesn't trend. And yet that is precisely where everything meaningful actually lives. Not in the revelation or the exposure or the moment the private became public. In the years of quiet work that came before all of it. In the choice, repeated, renewed, ordinary, to protect something worth protecting. Questions remain, as they always do when a story has been partially told in public and partially held back. According to those who have followed the full arc of their lives together, some of those questions may eventually find fuller answers. Others may simply belong to the two people most directly involved, as perhaps they should. When the last word has been written, and the last question has been asked, and the noise has finally settled into something quieter, there is always a moment of return. A return to the simpler, more essential reality that was underneath the story the entire time. Two people, a long and layered history, a choice made and remade across years of genuinely complicated circumstances to build something together rather than that is what this story is about, in the end. Not the scrutiny it attracted or the simplified versions that were offered in place of the full picture. Not the headlines or the timelines or the questions raised about the sequence of things. Those are surfaces. Beneath them is something quieter and more durable. Something that doesn't require an audience to be real. Savannah Guthrie has spent her professional life helping people understand complicated things. She has sat across from some of the most significant figures of the last 2 decades and asked the questions that needed to be asked with a clarity and composure that comes from genuine intellectual discipline, not from performance. That quality is not separate from who she is as a person. The same capacity that makes her effective on camera, the ability to hold complexity without needing to reduce it, to stay present with difficult information without being destabilized by it, is visible in the way she has moved through her private life as well. It is the same person on both sides of the camera. That consistency in a world that rewards personas over people, is itself something worth noting. Michael Feldman, for his part, has spent his professional life in a world where the gap between public narrative and private reality is something he has understood deeply. From the inside, for most of his adult life, he knows how stories get shaped. He knows what gets emphasized and what quiet.